In the summer of 1346, the winds of war swept across northern France, carrying the banners of a kingdom that believed itself invincible. The French knights, glittering in polished steel, wrapped in velvet and silk, were not merely soldiers. They were symbols of a divine order, the living embodiment of chivalry. For centuries, they had ruled the battlefield with their lances lowered and their faith unshaken. To them, the idea that a rabble of English archers could challenge their might was not just absurd, it was insulting. Pride had become their armor, and arrogance their shield. But beneath that pride, France was trembling. King Philip VI commanded one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen, tens of thousands strong, a force meant to crush Edward III of England, who had dared to claim the French crown. Edward's army, small and exhausted after weeks of pillaging through Normandy, seemed destined for destruction. Yet the English king had something the French lacked: discipline, patience, and the quiet genius of strategy born from desperation. When he chose his ground near the village of Crécy in Ponthieu, he turned the rolling fields into a killing field, one that would forever stain the honor of French knighthood. The rain had fallen hard the night before, turning the soft French earth into a mire. The English dug in, placing their longbowmen on the flanks and their men-at-arms in the center. They raised wooden stakes before their lines, crude, simple defenses that mocked the French belief in glory. As dawn broke, the French host appeared on the horizon, shimmering like a sea of steel. Trumpets played. Banners of noble houses fluttered in the wind. The ground shook beneath thousands of hooves. It was a sight to inspire awe and fear. King Philip's knights, driven by pride and impatience, would not wait for their full army to assemble. They believed one charge would shatter the English and end the humiliation of the campaign. Their arrogance was their enemy long before the battle began. When the Genoese crossbowmen, hired mercenaries in French service, took their positions, they were already exhausted from marching all day under a blazing sun. Their bowstrings, damp from the rain, were useless, yet Philip ordered them forward. The Genoese raised their weapons and fired, but their bolts fell short. The English longbows answered with a storm. Arrows rained down like iron hail, cutting through the air with a sound like tearing cloth. Horses screamed, men fell. The Genoese broke and fled. Philip, enraged at what he saw as cowardice, ordered his knights to trample them down and advance. The flower of French chivalry charged not once, but again and again, straight into the muddy slopes of Crécy. The English held their ground. The longbowmen loosed arrow after arrow, each shaft finding a target in the chaos. The French knights, weighed down by armor, slipped and stumbled in the mud. Their horses crashed into the wooden stakes, impaling themselves. The first wave fell, then the second, then the third. Still, the French pressed on, blinded by fury and shame. Their world, the world of shining tournaments and noble charges, was dying before their eyes. But they could not see it. As dusk fell, the field was a slaughterhouse. The cries of the dying echoed through the valley. Among the fallen lay nobles, counts, and princes, the proudest men in France. Even the blind king of Bohemia, John, had ridden into the fray, tied to his knights so he would not be left behind. He died swinging his sword in darkness, his courage wasted on a hopeless cause. When the sun rose the next day, thousands of bodies lay twisted in the mud, armored corpses reflecting the morning light like broken mirrors. France had lost not just a battle, but its illusion of invincibility. Crécy was more than a defeat, it was a revelation. The age of the knight was cracking under the weight of change. The longbow, a weapon of peasants, had humbled the greatest warriors of Europe. But the French refused to believe it. They called it luck, treachery, heresy, anything but what it truly was: the dawn of a new kind of war. In their hearts, they swore revenge. They would rebuild, relearn, and reclaim their honor. Yet in that vow lay the seeds of another tragedy, one that would come 70 years later. On another field soaked in rain and blood, the mud of Crécy would not be the last to swallow French pride. It was only the beginning. By the autumn of 1415, the kingdom of France stood fractured, torn not only by the long war with England, but by its own disease of pride and politics. The 100 Years' War had dragged on, consuming generations, and though the names of kings and commanders had changed, the arrogance that had doomed France before still lived in the hearts of its nobility. The lesson of Crécy had been written in blood. But pride is a stubborn teacher, and the knights of France refused to learn. King Henry V of England was young, cunning, and driven by a divine sense of purpose. He had crossed the Channel not as a reckless invader, but as a calculating conqueror. His campaign began with the siege of Harfleur, a brutal and costly victory that drained his army of men and morale. Disease and exhaustion ravaged his ranks. His knights were few, his archers starving. Any sane commander would have retreated to England. But Henry was not a man to bow before circumstance. Like Edward III before him, he understood that war was as much about the mind as it was about the sword. So, he marched northward, through hostile territory, toward the safety of Calais. The French knew he was coming, and they saw in him the perfect opportunity to erase the humiliation of Crécy and Poitiers, to wash away a century of defeat. Their army was vast, glittering, and eager. To the French nobility, Henry's weary soldiers were not an enemy to fear, they were prey. They had forgotten that the English thrived when cornered. They had forgotten that the mud of France favored not the proud, but the patient. The two forces met near a small village, Agincourt. The date was October 25, 1415, the feast of St. Crispin. The rain had been relentless, turning the plowed fields into a thick, sucking mire. To the English, it was a nightmare. To the French, a mere inconvenience. For in their minds, armor and numbers still ruled the day. They believed that honor was heavier than mud, and that chivalry would once again crush the peasant's bow. But the ground itself had other plans. As dawn crept across the soaked landscape, Henry's army took position in a narrow field flanked by woods. He placed his longbowmen on the wings, his dismounted knights and men-at-arms in the center. Wooden stakes were driven into the ground, jagged defenses that mirrored those at Crécy decades earlier. The French, blinded by overconfidence, did not see the pattern repeating before their eyes. The French line was massive, thousands of knights, men-at-arms, and crossbowmen stretching into the mist. Behind them, more ranks waited, too many men crammed into too little space. Their confidence was their prison. They were so eager to destroy the English that they crowded together, shoulder to shoulder, horse to horse, leaving no room to maneuver. Their commanders argued over glory, precedence, and honor. Who would lead the first charge? Who would claim the victory? While they debated, Henry's soldiers sharpened their stakes and whispered quiet prayers. When the order to advance finally came, the French moved forward slowly, struggling against the mud that clung to their boots and dragged at their horses' hooves. Arrows began to fall, first a few, then hundreds, then thousands. The sky turned dark with death. English longbowmen fired with machine-like rhythm, each man loosing up to a dozen arrows a minute. The sound was a steady roar, the drumbeat of doom. The first French line faltered. Horses screamed, men slipped and fell, trampled by those behind. The ground was so thick with mud that knights found themselves stuck fast, unable to rise once they fell. The weight of their armor, once their pride, became their curse. Arrows pierced visors and joints, finding flesh beneath steel. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, blood, and panic. The noble charge of France devolved into chaos. Henry watched from the center, calm and unflinching. His voice carried over the noise, firm and unshaken. "Hold," he commanded, "hold the line." When the French finally reached the English position, it was no longer a battle, it was slaughter. The French front ranks, exhausted from their charge, were crushed by their own men pushing from behind. They had nowhere to fight, nowhere to flee. The narrow field that was meant to trap the English had instead become their own tomb. The English archers, having spent their arrows, joined the melee wielding mallets, knives, and axes. They fell upon the trapped French with brutal efficiency, cutting through armor, smashing visors, dragging nobles into the mud to drown. The sound of dying men echoed for miles. The French banners, once proud symbols of glory, fell one by one into the filth. Among the fallen were the Dukes of Alençon, Brabant, and Bar, some of the most powerful men in France. They had come to win honor. They found only the cold embrace of the earth. By midday, it was over. Thousands of French knights lay dead or dying, their bodies piled in heaps. The English had lost only a few hundred. The difference was not strength or courage, it was wisdom. The French had walked willingly into the same trap that had destroyed them 70 years before. The mud, the arrows, the arrogance, all had returned, as if history itself demanded a cruel encore. When the rain stopped, the silence was unbearable. The battlefield of Agincourt was a mirror of Crécy, the same tragedy, repeated by the same pride. Even the French chroniclers could not hide their shame. "Our men were brave," one wrote, "but their bravery was foolish." The lesson of Crécy had been ignored. The knightly code that once defined Europe had become a curse. Honor had turned to vanity, and courage had turned to stubbornness. The French nobility, blinded by the ghosts of their own legend, had led themselves to ruin again. Henry V walked among the dead that night. He saw the faces of his enemies, men who had once laughed at his audacity, now pale, broken, and still. The mud that clung to their armor was the same mud that had swallowed their fathers and grandfathers. In that moment, history had come full circle. The field of Agincourt was not just a victory for England, it was the grave of medieval chivalry. When the mud dried at Agincourt, it hardened over more than corpses. It sealed away an age. The fields of northern France lay silent. No trumpets, no banners, only the wind moving across a sea of broken armor. Ravens gathered where proud chargers once stood. In the villages nearby, peasants crept out to strip the dead of mail and rings, prying gold from fingers that had once signed decrees and oaths of war. The flower of French nobility had withered in a single day, and Europe was left to ask how such splendor could rot so quickly. Word of the disaster spread, like fire, through monasteries and markets alike. Chroniclers wrote of divine judgment. Priests preached humility. Widows wept. Yet the truth was simpler and crueler. France had been defeated not by God, but by its own memory. The knights of Agincourt had ridden to avenge their fathers of Crécy, blind to the fact that the world around them had already changed. Henry V did not linger to gloat. His men were starving, disease still clung to them, and he knew that even victory could be fatal if pride followed. He marched north to Calais, leaving behind a field of mud that would be spoken of for centuries. Behind him, the chivalric dream began to crumble. For generations, Europe had built its faith on the mounted knight, the warrior saint, sworn to God and king. But the arrows at Agincourt had torn that myth apart. No longer did valor guarantee survival. No longer did noble birth ensure victory. The bow, the pike, and soon the gunpowder arquebus would decide battles, not coats of arms. The feudal order, forged in tournaments and crusades, began to rust out in France. The humiliation was unbearable. The court blamed treachery, bad weather, fate, anything but the arrogance that had doomed them twice. Families of fallen nobles demanded vengeance. Poets mourned the death of honor. But even in their grief, a quiet understanding spread among the surviving captains. The old ways no longer worked. Over the next decades, armor grew heavier, then vanished entirely. Horses gave way to disciplined infantry. The thunder of hooves was replaced by the crack of gunpowder. And with it, the very idea of the knight faded into legend. Those who once ruled battlefields now ruled ballrooms. Their swords, more decoration than weapon. Yet the ghosts of Crécy and Agincourt lingered. In every muddy trench, in every soldier's fear before the charge, lay the echo of those doomed riders who believed that courage alone could conquer the world. They had become a warning carved into the memory of Europe, that pride, untempered by wisdom, will always drown in its own glory. Henry V's triumph would not last forever. Within a few short years, disease and politics would undo much of what he had gained. But his victory at Agincourt outlived him not as a tale of English greatness, but as a lesson carved in steel and blood. It proved that power belongs not to the proud, but to those who adapt. And so, as centuries passed, storytellers would look back to those rain-soaked fields and whisper the same question. How could men so brave, so certain of their destiny, die so helplessly in the mud? The answer lies not in the weapons, but in the hearts that wielded them. History does not punish weakness. It punishes arrogance. The knights of France had been the envy of Christendom. Yet in their shining armor, they mistook tradition for truth. They charged headlong into the past while the future waited, bow drawn and steady. And when the arrows fell, it was not merely men who died, it was the age of the knight itself. Even now, if you stand in those quiet French fields after the rain, you can still feel it, the weight of history beneath your feet. The echo of hooves buried under centuries of earth. The mud remembers what men forget. If you've walked with us through the rise and fall of the knight, subscribe to this channel for more dark stories of pride, war, and the forgotten echoes of history. Because the past is never dead, it's only buried, waiting to be unearthed once more.